This discussion is about how to identify and evaluate effective school-based interventions. So we're going to start with just some information from the Rathwon text. And then this first thing is how interventions are determined in schools. Schools really like to do these intervention assistance teams. They come with a lot of different names. SST for student support team, or CST, child study team, or whatever. But they are, in essence, a group of individuals who get together to discuss the kinds of problems that a child is having and give advice to teachers on how to proceed. So within this, I'm going to say SST because that's what I was most familiar with. Within this SST framework, it is supposed to be a step by which the team members include multiple folks. There's no law that says who has to be in it. That's different from some of the other special education requirements because this is not special ed. This is regular ed. And so, but who usually is on it? Maybe are a couple of advanced teachers. Hopefully, these are mentor teachers who have been doing this for a while. Oftentimes, a school counselor, a school psychologist, maybe a parent representative, but that's a little tricky because of FERPA. And so that's kind of FERPA being the special ed law that says that whatever academic information or that's available to you actually, and then HIPAA is its partner, which is any kind of mental health or physical health information, is private and can't be shared with others. So if a parent comes and a teacher comes in and says, "Hey, I'm having problems with Johnny," that parent member now knows that Johnny is having a problem, and that has been released information to the parent. Anyway, so these intervention assistance teams, ideally, you're also going to have somebody who understands how to find and evaluate research-based interventions. That's kind of the entire goal of our discussion today, is making you one of the people who would be able to do that. And so within this, you want to make it, this IET needs to be collaborative. It's not top down. It's not like you come in and say, well, here's the intervention and you have to do it. You're not the boss. Instead, it's consultative, it's collaborative. You identify what are some of the issues that are there, and the team works together to figure out, oh, okay, so you're having problems in your class with um, addition. They're not really able to learn single digit addition. So let's go and let's back up and let's try and figure out exactly where the problems are and what are some of the things you've already tried. And here are some interventions that have been proven to be effective for other situations. So it's more collaborative. Um, you want to make sure that there are evidence-based interventions. Back when I first started, a student support team would be, here's a bunch of worksheets I had in my class that I made up 5 years ago. That's not an evidence-based intervention. An evidence-based intervention has been put through rigorous investigation, which means that there was data collected systematically, not retroactively, systematically, and there were subjects who actually did the interventions. There was some method to determine if they got any better, pre and post intervention, or even some sort of trend, how they did as they went along. And it was published in a legitimate source. So all of those things are part of what we use to determine if something is evidence-based. Evidence-based usually can just be replaced with research-based. So you want stuff that, the IET is there to help with remedial services. Teacher comes in and says, Johnny's having a really hard time with X. It can also be there to serve function for preventative services. And so what that means is that, okay, so we had, let's say we had a school shooting at a neighboring school. And now we need to make sure that our students at our school, that we provide preventative services, some outreach, some, counseling options, some whatever, evidence-based interventions that are determined specifically for this issue. And so that we can help students deal with how they feel about this so that it doesn't become a bigger issue for them later. You want to look at being that the problem is in the system. An IAT assumes the problem's in the system and not that there's something wrong with a child. And then you're looking for solutions. Remember, this is a general education issue. It's not special ed where you're trying to make a diagnosis. You're not saying something's wrong with Jimmy. You're trying to say something about the way that we're teaching Jimmy isn't working. Okay? And then there's always needs to be some sort of assessment to determine if the intervention is working. And we will spend many more discussions on how to choose the assessment and how to use progress monitoring data to make decisions. So why don't these things work? Because they don't work. What happens, I told you, ideally, it's a general education, completely standalone. It's all those things we just talked about. But in a lot of schools, it turns, you have all these great different people involved. And a lot of schools, it becomes a pre-referral team. They check off the boxes to say, yes, we had, the SST met and talked about Jimmy. And we tried a couple things, they didn't work. So now we need you to diagnose him. So, that first going in with the assumption of failure instead of success, that the team is going to fail because Jimmy actually has a problem instead of the system having a problem, is one of the reasons these fail across the board. But there's some other reasons. Oftentimes, the interventions are just really simple. They are low quality. They're not actually empirically based. The teacher doesn't actually do the intervention. Nobody follows up, nobody finds out, etc. A lot of times, punitive methods are favored over teachers other than reward methods. Punishing a child is a lot easier and faster than it is to set up a reward system. And you see an immediate effect if you punish a child. But the other side of it is it only works for a very short period of time. Reward systems tend to last longer and have longer effects, whereas punitive systems will have an instant, yes, they will stop doing whatever it is you want them to stop doing, but they don't, they're just going to start doing it again when you're not looking. Um, and then we keep going, so the teachers don't do the plan, no data is collected, or the data that is collected doesn't connect back to the problems. A lot of times you only see these in elementary school, you don't tend to see them in middle and high school. There's this assumption that all children are identified as having learning problems or needing support. By the time they get middle school and high school, they shouldn't be getting identified that way. They should already have been caught in elementary school. I can tell you that's not the case. And then you have the wrong people on the team. Instead of having school psychologists or behavioral specialists or specialists in reading recovery, things like that, you have the teacher who needs, who's not doing bus duties, so she gets to do this. Or you have the teacher, who is, who always sits on this team but never goes and gets any kind of training or support on how to do these sort of things. So let's talk about an evidence-based intervention. It involves rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures for data analysis. So I love this quote: the plural of anecdote is not data. I wish I could remember who it is that quoted it, but it's a great quote. Just getting a bunch of different bits of people telling, that's my personal experience, my personal experience says it works. That's not data because it's not objective. It's from your own personal point of view. You want to make sure that you have data. If you don't have data to analyze, you don't have evidence, right? And so you get results have to be obtained from valid data collection methodology, right? And then if it's been accepted by a peer-reviewed journal or approved by a panel of independent experts, that tends to be a really good indicator that it's evidence-based. So one of the best places that I tend to go to look for peer-reviewed journals, instead of just going to google.com, I'll go to scholar.google.com. And at scholar.google.com, they try and weed out all of the stuff that is just, I'm going to sell you my intervention. See, don't you want it? Like they try and give you only stuff from legitimate sources. So we have this interesting set of pictures on the right hand side about the indigo children. So this is where I'm going to take a moment and tell you about a case I had many years ago. I had a case wherein that the child had been homeschooled, and now he is, let's say, 12 years old. He's 12 years old, and his mother brings him in to start being in a traditional school. And mom is doing so because she's dying. She knows that she doesn't have a lot of time left and that he's going to end up in the foster care system. So she has decided to go ahead and, since he's going in foster care, he's going to eventually be placed into regular, school anyway. And so she wanted to be a part of that process. So she brings in her child, and as part of registration, states that her child is an indigo child, and is highly gifted. Um, but the child was completely alingual. There was no speech coming from the child at 12. So, in her, interviews with mom, looking up, all the stuff, she brings me these books. These are books that are some version of these books. And says, see, my child is just like this. You know, my child is so gifted that he can communicate telepathically. But you, meaning me, are so narrow-minded that you are not bright enough to talk with him. So, we test the child non-verbally. He is intellectually disabled. And, and that becomes a whole issue with mom, and that's a totally different story. But the end result of this is that mom found published materials, multiple authors here. Publishers she paid for these kind of books and these materials, but there's no intervention, there's no evidence, there's no real data to support this. If there was, it'd be available in the scholarly literature, and it's not. So just always, if somebody comes in to you with a diagnosis like this, or just interventions that they are convinced are for the best, then always go back and make sure. Don't take their word for it, especially if it's something that seems a little off. Go and research it and find out more about it. And if you can't find research for it, that's not a book that you have to pay for or a website you have to pay for, then, or even a website that's just created out there, just consider that, okay? So, how do you document? Well, these tend to be the Rathbone descriptions. You have some sort of evidence, data to support that it actually works, that it comes from an ecological perspective, and so that means that you're thinking that there's a problem in the system and not necessarily a problem in the child. You want something ideally that would help the entire classroom, and always it is better to catch the problem before it becomes a problem. So more proactive you can be, the better. If you're reactive, that's part of what happens, but ideally you would catch the problems early or do preventative work so that they don't happen at all. It needs to be something that if you have found it, you need to be able to share it with the teacher or the person implementing the program easily. If it's super complicated with a lot of moving parts or really expensive or whatever, they're not going to do it. And then you need to be able to use what's in the classroom, because remember, this is not a special ed, this is a general ed issue. And the evaluation methods need to have reliable, valid, and practical methods. And now we're going to talk more about reliability and validity at a later time, but just a heads up, reliable means that if I give the test today and I give it tomorrow, I'm going to get roughly the same score. And valid means that it actually measures what it says it measures. And then we have practical methods, which are, that they're doable. So with that in mind, when you're looking at these studies, you go in and you guys say, I've got to find these empirically based interventions. I need to find that they work for this child. So you're expected to go back into the literature and look at the original primary studies for this work. And you're going to see a lot of students who aren't familiar with stats yet, what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll read the introduction and lit review. They'll skip the results and the methods, and then they go straight to the discussion because they don't know how to read those. And, I'm not going to be able to teach you how to read those in a single discussion. That requires additional coursework. But I can talk to you about what some of these things mean so that if you do go through the reading of the different parts of the results sections, that you can at least identify what's being discussed. If you see that something is described as statistically significant, or you have a p-value at or below 0.05, that tends to be where we say, 0.05 tends to be where we look for statistical significance. What does it mean to be statistically significant? All it means is that it's rare. And in fact, in this case, with 0.05, it's that there is a 5% chance that there is no relationship or difference. And that means that there is a 95% chance that there is an actual relationship between the two things that are being measured, or three or four, or there's an actual difference between those things. And so what you really want to see with statistical significance is that the data you collected indicates that the intervention you put in place most likely is the reason that you had any pre or post test differences or whatever else it is. So 95% chance means that it's pretty certain that it didn't just happen. Instead, there's a really good indicator here that there was some sort of relationship between what happened in terms of results, pre-test and post-test, and what you did when you did the intervention. That's all statistical significance says, is that was it rare? And if it was it rare enough that it could only really have happened because of the intervention you put in place and not just random chance? Practical significance. Does it really make a difference in someone's life? So statistically significant would say, oh, the pre and post test scores are so different from one another. So we're talking about differences here, that they're so different from one another that it's not due to chance. Okay, great. So it would not be an unusual thing. It would be a really unusual thing for this to happen without the intervention. Practical significance is, so what? Is it a big enough difference or improvement that in the end, it's worth the effort, right? So there may be a difference, a real difference caused by the intervention, but is it big enough for us to care? You put in all this effort, all this work, is it big enough for us to care? So practical significance tends to be measured by something called effect size. And often effect size is based off of Cohen's descriptions of effect size, wherein that you really kind of want to see at least a 0.15 or above to say that it matters, right? Usually even 0.25 is considered to be more ideal. Anything below 0.13, it may have been rare, but who cares? So this is the next part of the statistics primer. There are certain statistical tests that we use to determine if something is meaningful. And there are different tests for different questions that ask about differences. So did he do better on the pre-test or the post-test? Um, that kind of thing. Are there differences between how boys and how girls respond to the intervention or whatever it is? Anything that responds to, is there a difference between A and B, or even A, B, and C, or whatever? These are the stats you're going to see. So if you see in a paper that says ANOVA, MANOVA, or a t-test, that flat out is just telling you that what their research question was, is there a difference between something and something else, right? So the next thing is trend analysis. Trend analysis also looks at differences, but it looks a little different. Instead, it's more of a graph. Now there's other ways to do trend analysis, but trends tend to be, are we seeing that the change when plotted on a graph shows improvement at a rate that we would expect? I don't expect you to know how to do trend analysis after today's discussion. There are other discussions specifically on trend analysis for you to look at in terms of interventions and how that's done in the schools. What I really want you to get out of it is that these things, ANOVA, MANOVA, t-test, and trend analysis, those all measure differences. Whereas if you see these other things, correlations, regressions, factor analysis, or structural equation modeling, those things are looking at relationships. Is A related to B? Things like the number of drinks that you have related to the number of car accidents that you have, right? It's not a pre and post, it's not differences, it's a relationship. So if you see these words, correlation, regression, factor analysis, structural equation modeling, you understand that they're measuring the relationship between something and something else. ANOVA, MANOVA, t-test, and trend analysis, that is measuring the difference between something and something else. And then each of those in their own way will provide a statistically significant value, which is that relationship rare, or is that difference rare? And they will also provide a practical significance. Many of them provide some sort of effect size, which is it meaningful? So by seeing the name of the test that was given, the test being ANOVA, MANOVA, whatever, and reading the statistical data, the p-value and the effect size data, you now should be able to determine the two things. Is it, what were they examining, differences or relationships? And what did they find? Did they find it to be unusual or rare? And did they find it to actually be meaningful? So there's just some little stat stuff for you to keep in mind. This is not a stats class, so just want to make sure that you are aware that these things exist. So if you have even a teeny, 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 tiny, tiny effect size, so any change at all, some little tiny change happened, at some sample, which is the way these stat tests work, at some sample, if you have 2 million people, you're going to get statistical significance. So just because it's statistically significant doesn't mean it's practically significant. You really want to look at both. Effect sizes are then used in something called meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are not looking at relationships, and they're not looking at differences. What they do is they go in and they may look at 30 studies that all measure the exact same intervention. So they look at those 30 studies, they pull the effect sizes from those studies, and then they pool them together to determine if kind of I'm doing this, it's sort of cheating the way I'm describing it because it's not real, but it's at least an idea for you to understand. They kind of average out those effect sizes and say, yeah, we found that consistently, here's how well this worked across multiple publications or multiple studies. So if something is not statistically significantly different, journals won't publish it. Or it's not statistically significantly related, journals won't publish it. And so what is a big problem with this model? Well, remembering that statistically significant differences or relationships are just based on chance. And let's say that you had 100 people do the exact same study, and 95 of them found nothing at all. and 5% of them did. They got statistical significance. Well, that's the exact nature of what we just talked about. Statistical significance values are going to say that 95% of the time, it's just chance, nothing. And 5% of the time, you're going to find something. So if they only publish the ones that found something, they're going to say that there's a difference or relationship when there really isn't. That was just bad luck. So you have to be cautious. One of the reasons we like meta-analyses is that they give us data across multiple studies. So we can just get, or if you see a study and it looks too good to be true, see if you can find a couple other studies that also support it. So the more studies that also found statistical significance and effect sizes that match what you're expecting, the more you can be certain that it is empirically based. So evidence-based intervention, this is talking about a documented evidence of effectiveness, consistent with ecological perspective, emphasis on a proactive approach to classroom problems. You can do it classroom-wide, ideally, and then you can easily teach it, you have the resources for it, and you're using data collection methods that are sound. So I want for you to take a few minutes. Here at the end of this, there is an article that I have attached here for you. It's called The Effects of a Computer-Based Early Reading Program on the Early Reading and Oral Language Skills of At-Risk Preschool Children. I want you to examine this article. It's in your materials. And I want for you to evaluate it based off of each of these criteria. In addition, I want for you to determine what statistical tests were they given, MANOVA, regression, whatever. And then what did they find in terms of statistical significance and effect size. Now, if there's no effect size reported, because I don't remember at this time, then it's not the end of the world. But just try and go through and suss this out. And in the end, saying that if you had a teacher come to you and say, hey, I'm thinking about using this program for my preschoolers. What do you know about it? Is it going to work for me? I want you to be able to use this article to discuss it with them. So take some time, write this out, and answer these questions. All right. We will start part 2 in a few moments, or when you're ready, I guess.